to friends, family, and the universe. 24 hours of music and talk. Radio without limits. That's why people keep coming back for more. That's UBNradio.com.
Welcome to the National Safe Child Show, addressing the health, safety, and welfare of all children nationwide, because it shouldn't hurt to be a child. Here is your host, Tammy Stefano.
Hi folks, welcome to the National Safe Child Show. We have a remarkable show tonight. We have a wonderful guest who's coming on, who's fighting the good fight and making a difference in this country and in the world. Investigative journalist, and I want to make sure I say his name right, Lee Stranahan. Lee has been exceptionally important in the movement in South Dakota. Now, when I think about South Dakota, folks, I think, outdoors. I don't think about CPS moving in, law enforcement failing, and I certainly don't consider genocide. But after reading so many articles, there's nothing other than genocide of the Native Americans that reside within the small state of South Dakota. So I don't know if we have this wonderful gentleman on the line yet. Hi, Lee, are you with us?
I sure am. How you doing, Tammy?
I'm doing well, Lee. I thank you so much for taking your time and devoting it yet again for the benefit of these children and the Native Americans in South Dakota. I'm not going to be speaking a lot because we really just want to listen. You're a plethora of information. So please introduce yourself to the audience and let's delve right in.
Sure, yeah. My name's Lee Stranahan. You pronounced it exactly right.
Excellent.
And I'm a investigative journalist, and I've written for two of the biggest political websites in the country, the Huffington Post, which is a liberal site, and now I write for Breitbart News, which is a conservative site. And I'm sort of an equal opportunity. I have my own political views, but I go after bad things wherever I see them. So the situation in South Dakota is amazing, and because the local press, by which I mean the media in the state of South Dakota, hasn't covered this story we're about to talk about. And I mean, they really ignored it.
Which is amazing.
Because of that, it's barely made it out to the rest of the nation. In other words, the only way people would have heard about it if the local papers, the Argus Leader in Sioux Falls, which is the biggest city in South Dakota,
right,
or the Rapid City Journal, had really covered this story at any point. It would have made national news multiple times. As it is, NPR, National Public Radio, has done, I would say, half a dozen or so segments on it, which have been good. But as we'll talk about, even NPR got slapped down by the state of South Dakota, which is pretty amazing. So that's what we're talking about. You say it's a small state, and it's what I refer to it as a big small state. It's a very large amount of land.
Right.
It takes about 4 hours to drive north to south in South Dakota, and it takes about 7 hours to drive east to west. So
right.
It's and that's highway driving, right? So
right.
It's big. But there's only about 815 or 20,000 people in the whole state.
Right.
So, by contrast, I live in Dallas, Texas, and the city of Dallas is about double that size, and that's not really including a lot of the suburbs. And so you have one of the smallest population states, but like I say, a very, very big state geographically. And you also have a decent-sized Lakota Indian population. There are 8 different Lakota tribes.
Okay.
And in South Dakota, and as is typical with Native American tribes across much of the country, unless they are in the casino business, they're very poor. I lived in New Mexico too, and you could see it there. The Native Americans. In fact, let's put some numbers on this. South Dakota has the poorest city in the country.
Really?
In it.
I didn't know that.
The poorest town. Yeah, and it's a Native American town. And I'll tell you, I'm not looking at my notes right now. It's going to sound like I'm wrong, but I'm telling you I'm not wrong. If I'm off by a little bit.
Okay.
I think the per capita income in that town is $3,500 a year. $3,500 a year.
Oh my God.
It's like I say, it sounds like that can't possibly be right, but that's what the number is. And like I say, it's got the poorest town and a few of the poorest counties in the entire country. And geographically, one of the problems that South Dakota has is it's not a natural resource rich state. People often confuse South Dakota with North Dakota. South Dakota's got the Mount Rushmore.
Okay. Right.
And North Dakota's where the oil boom's happening right now. So there's a lot of money and jobs up in North Dakota, which has oil. Montana and Wyoming, which are right to the west of South Dakota, have mining. And then the other states around it, Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota, have farmland, which is literally twice as good as the farmland in South Dakota. So for that reason, South Dakota is a very poor state. Now, that being said, I just want to paint a complete picture. I really like Sioux Falls and Rapid City. I like those towns quite a bit. And, for instance, there's a very vibrant restaurant scene in Sioux Falls and some of the best coffee shops I've ever been to. Coffee shops that if you had them in L.A. or New York, they're just great. The baristas are great. So I don't want to paint a picture of like it just a patch of dirt and people crying. There's some wealth in Sioux Falls because the banking industry moved in a few decades ago. And the reason the banking industry moved in is it's a poor state, and in order to attract them, banks, they basically changed the law so there's almost no top end to what you can charge for interest in South Dakota.
Wow.
So a lot of the payday loan companies and credit card companies have based themselves in South Dakota because then they can charge,
there's no
30%
cap.
interest.
Sure.
Exactly right. And that was specifically done by the governor, Bill Janklow, at the time, who went to Citibank and said, well, what would it take to get you to move here? So that's just an example of the kind of stuff that they've had to do to get money. Now, the reason I bring all this up is because you have to understand that background to understand why they're stealing children, why they're kidnapping children in South Dakota.
And who are they?
The state of South Dakota, the state of South Dakota, the Department of Social Services.
Okay.
One thing that comes up when you research it is the state of South Dakota's Department of Social Services, from the research I did, is at least 10 percentage points higher in terms of the overall budget for the state of South Dakota than any of the other states that are the same size that surround it. In other words, the Department of Social Services is like 35%. I'm not looking at my notes, but let's say it's 35% of the state of South Dakota's budget on just the Department of Social Services. Okay. When you look at other states, they're like 25%. So a lot of money comes into the Department of Social Services in South Dakota. So why is that? Where does it come from? When you take a child out of a home and you put them into foster care or they're adopted, the federal government gives the state of South Dakota money. Does that make sense? So,
absolutely.
So they get matching funds. And what they did was, with the Lakota Indians, they passed a law. So here's the way it works in most parts of the country. If I adopt a child, I get a certain amount of money from the state, and some of that comes from the federal government, right? That makes sense?
Yes.
I'm doing something positive. I'm taking a kid in. So there's that. If I take a special needs kid in, right? Let's say a child who's autistic or handicapped in some way, right?
Right.
You get more money. And that makes sense too, right? That makes sense. Because there's going to be more cost, right? So that makes sense.
Right. I have an attorney that's with us that's asking, why is South Dakota so high? Do you have any idea?
Well, let's talk about that. That's
okay.
what we're about to talk about. So what they did was they passed a law that all Lakota Indians are special needs kids.
Okay.
Okay. So if you've got an Indian kid who is like Albert Einstein and Tiger Woods combined,
okay,
they're still a special needs kid.
Automatically.
Every Indian kid is a special needs kid,
wow.
which means the state has financial incentive to take Indian kids, and they have. So let's talk again at a sort of big level here.
Okay.
In a one courtroom in Rapid City, and this has been adjudicated, and people can look this up. They're referred to as the Gone in 60 Seconds hearings for reasons you'll hear in a second. But if people want to Google this, and they can find the court thing, it was Rapid City. The judge is Jeff Davis, Rapid City, South Dakota. And then type in like Indian ACLU,
okay,
and you'll find this stuff right away. Now, here's what happened. There's a courtroom in Rapid City where for 5 years, children were being taken from their parents and placed with social services in hearings that lasted 1 to 3 minutes long, where the parents were not allowed to hear the accusations against them, hear from the people making the accusations. The parents weren't allowed to present any evidence. The parents weren't allowed to speak. They weren't allowed to say anything. And they weren't allowed to have an attorney. And this happened with hundreds of children over a 5-year period. Now, just stop and think about that for a second. That's completely unconstitutional. And right, you're not supposed to have hearings where you're not allowed to hear the accusations against you or have an attorney or speak. And the kids were taken in those hearings. If it was like 80% of the time, that would be pretty high, right? If it was 90% of the time, that would be very high.
That's
but
right.
The kids in this courtroom were taken 100% of the time. Every single solitary case.
Throughout the 5-year period? Throughout all 5 years, 100% of the children?
100% of the cases. Every single case. And the children were taken, and then what would happen is the Department of Social Services would say to the parents, so now imagine this, right? And by the way, let's just be clear on this. Some of those kids, I'm sure, should have been taken. Does that make sense? In other words, I'm not trying to make the case.
There's always some children. Right, I get that. We get that, but never 100%. I mean, the department has clearly proven that they make mistakes all the time. So we can, theorize a certain percentage of the children were potentially in danger. Okay, but 100% anyway is unheard of.
Crazy.
It couldn't be fathomed in your wildest of dreams.
No, that's right. Yeah, and they weren't allowed to present evidence. So then what would happen is and by the way, when I say the story never made it out, the local media, this lawsuit was going on for years, basically, where the ACLU stepped in and sued the state of South Dakota. It was barely covered in the South Dakota media. Almost nobody covered it. In fact, when a judge ruled last year on this case and basically said to South Dakota, you have completely violated these parents' constitutional rights and their rights as Indians, which I'll talk about in a second. it made the NPR, National Public Radio, covered it. The local papers in the big paper in Sioux Falls, which is a major city, the Argus Leader. That paper is owned by the same people who own USA Today, Gannett. Okay?
Oh, I know Gannett.
So they're not like.
I used to work for
like
Gannett.
Mm-hmm. Well, there you go. So they're not like a local paper. They're like a real newspaper. Yes. I don't know how else to put it.
Yes.
They didn't cover it at all. They didn't mention a single thing about that ruling. And by the way, that ruling was historic. It was the first time ever in history that the Department of Justice has weighed in on an Indian Child Welfare Act case, ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, which was passed about 30 years ago.
1978, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And so aside from the constitutional issues, which are clear.
Which are very clear.
Very clear.
The violations, yes.
There's additional ones because this ICWA law was passed to keep the state from taking kids. That's why it was passed. I interviewed Jim Aberesk, who was the senator at the time, U.S. senator from South Dakota, who wrote ICWA. And, And he lives in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His wife owns a restaurant there. And he's in his 80s, I think, and but still very with it, right? And has all his faculties. And I interviewed him, and he explained why ICWA was passed and how nothing's being done. And he's as clear as can be. He just said they're racist. He said they're racist against the Indians in South Dakota. And they think they're doing them a favor by taking their kids.
Let me ask you something. When they take the kids, maybe it's premature. Where are they placing these children? Are they placing them out of? I mean, if it's a racist issue and they think that there's an alternate place. Go ahead.
Well, let me tell you what Jim Aberesk told me, because he had a very good explanation of this. He said that they had done studies, and they had found that Indian kids are better off in Indian families. And part of what ICWA says is you have to do everything in your power to try to place an Indian kid with an Indian family. And I asked him, well, why is that? Why is it they're better? And he said, it's real simple. He said, because what we found was everything's fine with the Indian kids till about the time they hit high school. So let's say it's an Indian kid adopted into a white family. He said about junior high and high school, they suddenly discover that they're Indian. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, because now they ask Sally out, right? So it's an Indian guy. He asks Sally out, a white girl, and Sally's parents freak out because they don't want Sally. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
And the Indian kid was raised in a white family, so he never really thought of himself as Indian, right? He just, all he knows is he's growing up, right? And suddenly it's made very clear to him that he's an Indian. And South Dakota, I got to point out that South Dakota's got another big historical problem that goes back to the 50s, which was the rampant molestation of children who were placed in Mormon and Catholic Indian schools. Okay. So, and when I say rampant and known, so there's been all these lawsuits against the Catholic diocese, and one of the dioceses who got sued was Minneapolis. In fact, they just settled. They just had to declare bankruptcy, and they just went through this whole thing, right? So the Minnesota diocese controlled the Indian schools in South Dakota. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because, right, so that, in terms of the church hierarchy. And when they were suing in Minnesota, letters came out. And what I'm about to say, it's almost a verbatim quote. I'm not looking at my notes, but once again, it's so horrific. There was a letter that in the 60s, they said, one of the priests who was minding the Indian kids, they said, well, and these were the priests and the church hierarchy
Right.
sending letters back and forth amongst themselves. They said, well, he's got a bit of a drinking problem, and we found torn panties in the basement. So he's got a bit of a little girl problem.
Wow.
And that's what they were talking about, right? So you've got a generation of Indians, men and women, who were raped and molested for years in these Indian schools. Now, very interesting thing happened. A few years ago, there were a few dozen lawsuits making their way through the courts about this, and this is part of South Dakota history.
Okay.
And the lawsuits are making their way through the court. And this tells you how corrupt the state of South Dakota is. One of the attorneys for the church was also in the South Dakota legislature. And at the end of the session, he wrote and passed a law that literally threw out every single case. He basically said, you can't sue an organization if it was more than 25 years ago or something. It effectively threw out dozens of cases because it was retroactive. Does that make sense?
It does. I know that there's a lot of states, though, that don't have statutes relative to clergy abuse anymore. I think there's like 13 and climbing.
And South Dakota used to be one of those. But
And
at
that
the last
changed.
minute, right before these cases were going to court, the attorney for the church, who was in the legislature, wrote a law, passed it, and the governor, who's Catholic, by the way, and I have nothing against Catholics. I'm pointing that out, though, because I think it's significant.
Well, yes, it is.
The governor, who's Catholic, signed it,
Okay.
and that governor is now the U.S. Senator for the state of South Dakota, Mike Rounds. Now, by the way, when I uncovered this story, I was in South Dakota. I spent about 14 months there in the past 2 years. And I went to Governor Rounds to ask him about it. And while he was running for Senate, and I had the videos up on YouTube, he pretends not to hear me. And I'm physically assaulted at one point. I'm being pushed and shoved.
By whom?
He refuses to, by his people.
His staff.
By his staff, who, and you can see he's pretending not to hear me. He refused to answer, and at the end of the election, the last month or so of the election, they knew I was going to go and ask them questions wherever they were. And so they did everything they could. They would duck out the back door. They would do everything else. The media never covered it. It's 100% clear. As I say, the letters from the diocese. See, here's what happens in these cases, just to explain, right? So why didn't the plaintiffs sue earlier, right?
Right.
And the reason why is because the church was hiding this information. So it was only because they sued the diocese and then they got discovery. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Like 25 years later, suddenly there's a letter that proves that the hierarchy
right.
absolutely
It
knew
debunks
about it.
it debunks the story that they wanted the public to believe. And finally,
Right.
all this time later, when they're safe and there's no chance for recourse, especially financially, then all of a sudden the discovery comes forward and the truth comes out, albeit too late for any compensation for the victims of these crimes.
And that's right. And in this case, they threw it out. And so some people are like, well, why didn't they sue 20 years ago? And the answer is because there was no proof.
Right.
Right?
The evidence, the exculpatory evidence was suppressed, as it often is, until again.
Yes.
Okay, we get it.
And so a ton of these. So because of the lawsuit in Minnesota, a ton of material came out that proved what had happened in South Dakota. Right?
With the Native American children.
To the Native American children, 100% proved it.
Okay.
And these cases of these 60 and 70-year-old people. And by the way, one of the problems with that Indians have is rampant alcoholism. Okay? Now, is it possible that if you were let's say, molested over and over as a child by people who were ostensibly.
Right. Naturally. I mean, research clearly shows that victims of child sexual abuse do often turn to drugs, alcohol, promiscuity, and the like.
And then often, in some cases, become abusers themselves.
Yes.
And so the reason this stuff that happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s is not ancient history. It's living history that's caused, you have a generation of Lakota who went through this systemic abuse, who then had kids, right?
Right.
Who then had kids.
Right.
And you're seeing a lot of the effects of that.
Right. The cycle.
Now.
Right.
Now you're seeing it now, where so that relates, because what happened was there's a political machine, and I mentioned I've written on the left and the right. I'm a Republican, okay? I'm a conservative Republican, and South Dakota is a Republican state. It's run by Republicans,
right?
And I am here to tell you, as a Republican, there is no more corrupt state in the country than South Dakota. It is the most corrupt state in the country. And
have you had an opportunity to experience other states in such depth to make that statement?
Well, here's why.
Okay.
First off, if you look at list of the most corrupt states in the country,
yes,
South Dakota's always in like the top 5 or 10. They're like always right up top. So that's usually like Georgia, Louisiana, Nevada, maybe, right? And South Dakota is in there, maybe 2, maybe 3. But a list that I had nothing to do with, South Dakota comes up over and over and over again.
Okay.
The reason I say it's the most corrupt state is because in a place like Georgia, let's say, or even Louisiana, there's competition amongst the media. There's, you can move, right?
Right.
You can leave. If you're having problems in Athens, you can go to Atlanta in Georgia or whatever. And in South Dakota, it's such a tight political machine.
Right.
And everybody knows everybody. And that sounds like a cliche, but I'm telling you, I had one conversation. I was talking to a source on stuff. We were walking through the grocery store. And 2 days later, somebody said to her, "You better watch out what you say in public, because it got back to me that you were talking to Lee about blah, blah, blah."
Right. So
and
there's all eyes are everywhere. Yeah. Yeah.
And literally it's everybody knows everybody. And there's a political machine where the ex-governor, who's now the U.S. Senator, Mike Rounds, who signed that bill, he appointed Marty Jackley, who's the Attorney General. And Marty Jackley, by the way, is a powerful figure. He's the head of the National Association of Attorneys General.
Ah.
So even though he's from a small state in South Dakota, he's the head.
Wow, that's
of
interesting.
The national. And if you want to see an Attorney General running, again, it's up on YouTube. I went and asked him questions, and he did the same thing as Mike Rounds. He pretended not to hear me.
Did he assault you? Did he have his guys assault you too? Or
no, he was
nicer.
Well, no, he was well. I wouldn't say that.
Yeah. Okay.
He was alone, and my camera was running the whole time, and here's why.
Okay.
These guys have never had a tough question asked of them in their lives. Okay, if you're a politician in California, New York, right?
Right.
You've had the media come up to you and ask you stuff. I mean, that you're used to it. These guys have never had a tough question ever one time asked them. And I saw it. I saw it when I was up there. And it took me a while to figure this out. I had to be in South Dakota. I had to move, live there, and interview dozens and dozens of people, and try to separate out fact from fiction. But it is an astoundingly corrupt state where you can't escape it because everybody knows everybody. So the only way to escape it's to move. It's literally to
If you don't want to be
state.
part of the corruption, and you're a resident in South Dakota, and you've somehow been targeted, the only escape you're saying is to leave South Dakota.
That's right, because
Okay.
they will. Marty Jackley has prosecuted people, and the case is the Medi rape
unjustly.
scandal.
That's what I want to get into now, so we don't.
Absolutely unjustly, clearly unjustly, where there's a ton of documentary evidence, including phone calls and emails and everything else that shows what they did. And the case, if people Google it, it's the Medi rape scandal, Mette. That's one word. It's the last name of Richard and Wendy Medi, who were the foster parents, white foster parents, who took in Lakota kids. And the evidence showed that Richard Medi was raping and molesting the kids for years. And for years and years and years. And I interviewed the CPS was called in originally in, I want to say 2003.
Okay.
But
so
again,
there were
right
allegations. There were allegations that these children were being abused within the Maddie household with Wendy Maddie and Mr. Maddie.
Well, the allegation was that Richard Medi was molesting them. And that Wendy Medi
was allowing
knew and
it.
wasn't stopped.
Right.
Yeah. And I interviewed Jordan Anderson. Jordan is one of two brothers who were placed in that home. And the reason the 2003 complaint happened, the initial complaint, was because their aunt, what happened was there was pornography everywhere out in the open in the house.
Okay.
And Richard Medi would be like, hey, kids, hey, why don't you sit down and watch a video? And there'd be a pornographic video. And these kids were like, I want to say 11 and 13, maybe.
Do you know how many
Jordan
children? Do you know how many children that they had, that they were given?
Yes. They adopted, I believe, 6. I'm just going through my thing. I think it was 6 they adopted. And then they also had temporary custody of some kids. The Andersons were there. So there was porn everywhere. The house was disgusting. And Jordan Anderson told me that he felt as though Richard Medi had made a sexual advance towards him at one point. And this is all on record. Jordan, the reason I'm using his name is he's 22 now, something like that. And
he came forward.
He came forward. We did an interview. He's been very supportive. And so the interviews out there, and he's been very open about this.
Okay.
Stuff.
All right.
So
Some people are.
And God bless him for that. And so, because he didn't do anything wrong. So,
of course not.
Right? So he's not ashamed because he didn't do anything wrong at all. And so the CPS came in, and there was pornography. There was evidence that they were beating the kids when they weren't supposed to be, and of inappropriate touching. And the state said, well, don't do that again. And they made them sign a piece of paper that Richard and Wendy Medi said they wouldn't do that again. So they got Jordan and Lewis out of there, but they kept the girls in. Right. 2007, there's another complaint. Nothing has changed. And the oldest sister of these girls who were adopted from 2 different Indian families, by the way, but they're sisters, right?
Okay.
So the oldest sister files a complaint because there's pornography everywhere, and one of the girls is saying, I'm being molested. They come out in 2007. They do interviews. They don't do anything. Now, they've already been given
a warning.
In 2003, a warning, right? And in 2007...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Lee, but would it be fair to say that when they were given that warning, they, in fact, the Department of Children and Family Services, Child Protective Services, did see some of the porn that you had mentioned a couple of minutes ago and admonished them that it was inappropriate?
Yeah, and again, it was in public areas of the house.
Right.
It's got to be clear.
Right.
So then in 2007, they come out, they do an investigation, they find there's pornography in places, the kids are still being beaten, and there's inappropriate touching. One of the girls says, I was inappropriately touched. And by the way, you have to picture this. Richard Meddy is 6'9", 310 pounds.
Oh, my God.
He's a giant. He's a giant of a man, and so there's claims of abuse. Not only that, but I published this subsequently.
Okay.
Just 3 or 4 months after the investigation, the Department of Social Services in South Dakota does their year-end written evaluation of Richard and Wendy Meddy. And the same person who wrote the evaluation was one of the people who was in on the investigation. Does that make sense? Same person. So
yes.
You can't claim one hand doesn't know what the other one's doing. It's the same person.
Right.
Not a single mention is made of the allegations or the prior allegations in that year-end report. Not one mention is made of it.
So what did they say? The children are fine, everything's fine in that household, and if they can fit another one in...
Children are fine.
Yeah.
Everything's fine, and there's no problem.
Okay.
And at the time, in 2007, the investigation is headed up by a state's attorney in that county named Kim Dorsett.
Okay.
Okay? And she's the one who heads the investigation. So... then in 2010, one of the kids is in legal trouble. He's been arrested, and he's now in treatment, and he's in his teens, and he's in like a group therapy situation, something like that.
Okay.
And he starts talking about the abuse that was going on. So another investigation happens, and now finally, in 2010, an attorney named Brandon Tollifer and a child advocate named Shirley Schwab get involved in the case. And this time, there's no denying it. The police go in, they find the pornography everywhere in open areas, and they find in the family room, they find in the bedroom pornography that's incest porn. It's not child pornography, but it's pornography about incest. Does that make so? I know it may sound like a fine line, but
right. No, I understand.
It's right, and they find it in the bedroom under the bed. Now they've already signed twice. We're not going to do that again. We're not going to have it. And they find sex dice in the living room.
Okay.
Sex dice are dice where one of the die, you roll them like you roll dice, but they say on one of the dice it says kiss and lick and touch, and then the other die is various body parts. So you roll them, and then that's what you do. Does that make sense?
While other children were playing outside and playing with, riding bikes, these children were forced, all Native American children, forced, even though everybody was aware, to play the dice game with the Nephilim father. Got it.
Well, and one of the girls is, she's brought in. They're starting to open up. The father's out of the house. They're separated from the mother. So that now they start opening up. And one of the other things that the girl says is that she was forced to play a game, I'll euphemize it, called Beating or BJ. And where the father would take a 9-year-old
So wait a minute,
girl.
just to be clear, Beating or blowjob was the name that she had to.
That's right.
That was the game that was given to this young child who was taken away from her family, her Native American biological family, supposedly to be placed in a safe scenario, a safe home.
Yeah, and so a 9-year-old, and by the way, this went on night after night after night. This went on for years. This molestation went on for years and years and years at various points with all the kids, basically, all of the younger kids. Because why not? In other words, if you've gotten away with it in 2003 and you've gotten away with it in 2007,
right?
You follow me?
Right.
As far as Richard Meddy's concerned, well, he can get away with it. So
I want to let you know we have to speed it up. I don't want to interrupt you. However, there are some really important points. They're all important, and I know we'll have to do this again, but that I want the listeners to understand. And we have about 10 minutes left. So what happened was to cut to the chase. What happened very quickly was they had the case against Richard and Wendy Meddy. It was going ahead. Wendy Meddy was charged not with molestation, but with the beatings that she'd done. The physical beatings.
Suddenly,
the
physical beatings, and then she knew about it.
Okay.
And then suddenly, National Public Radio does a story on Lakota families.
Right. Let's talk about that.
And now the eyes of the, and now suddenly, which, by the way, the government of South Dakota, the governor and the attorney general, refused to cooperate on that story at all in any way. And
not surprising.
No, not surprising at all, because they're completely corrupt. So it brings out what had happened, right?
Okay.
So suddenly what happens is they throw out the case against Wendy Meddy.
Okay.
They do a plea bargain with Richard Meddy, and they return the girls who are now living with their older sister and are thriving to Wendy Meddy.
Back to the house where they experienced trauma their entire lives. Rape, pornography,
right, yes.
Filming, dice games, threats.
Yep. And
who made that decision? Was that the court? Was that the prosecutor?
It was done by the Attorney General. It was done with the full knowledge and approval of the Attorney General. But not only that, the prosecutor, Brandon Tolliver, and the child's advocate, Shirley Schwab, who were protecting the kids, Brandon Tolliver gets fired on the orders of the Attorney General. Okay?
Okay.
Kim Dorsett's the one who fired. And by the way, Kim Dorsett, who was in the 2007 case, because what had happened was the kids' lawyers were going to sue the state. This is what happened. The kids' lawyers were going to sue the state. And so, in order to get rid of the suit, they put the kids back with Wendy Meddy. And then they prosecute Tolliver and Schwab. They prosecute the lawyer and the child's advocate for witness tampering. And they're trying to put them in jail for 30 years.
For witness tampering? Tampering with what witness?
They said that they had forced the kids to say what they'd said. And there's no proof of that. So their reputations are destroyed. The press reports, oh, look, because the Attorney General's saying they violated the thing, right?
Right.
They were horrible, at their job, and they violated the kids. So that goes to trial, okay?
Okay.
That trial, here's how that goes. The state presents their case against Tolliver and Schwab.
Okay.
The prosecution rests. And the judge did something he's only done a couple of times in 30 years of being on the bench. He says, we don't need to go any further on the trial. You don't need to put up a defense. I'm throwing this out. There's absolutely this was a retired judge who'd been assigned to the case.
Okay.
So he wasn't beholden to anyone politically.
Right, okay.
Okay. He throws out the case against Tolliver and Schwab, saying, you don't have any case whatsoever. So when I say the state had no case, I'm just repeating what the judge said. The judge said the state has no case against them whatsoever. But then what's happened is Tolliver can't get his record expunged. So he's unable to practice law any place in the country now. Because he still got on his record that he was arrested,
right,
even though it was thrown out halfway through.
Right. Well, that's the way unfortunately, that's the way that it goes. But there was a GAL, a guardian ad litem, that was assigned to these children. Can you touch base on that for a moment?
Well, yeah, there were several lawyers who were representing the kids at one point. There was a prosecutor in the prosecution's case. There was a GAL,
right,
a guardian ad litem, and she was basically she had recommended that a separate attorney be found for the kids so they could file a civil suit. And that's when things went south. She won't talk. The GAL won't talk. She refuses to talk.
What is her name?
You know what? I'm spacing on it right now.
Okay.
It's in my reporting. She's
okay. That's all right.
Man,
that's all right. You can always
now.
post it later because we are going to drive people to medicalkidnap.com. Did a fabulous article, and we've put it in the chat room. You have a blog page and you have a Facebook page that I would like to tell the audience now so that they can follow up with more details about what we are discussing right now. Could you please give us that?
Yeah, it's Dakota Reporter, like South Dakota.
And this is on Facebook.
Reporter, yeah, or if you go to dakotareporter.com,
okay,
a number of things up there. But the other place to go is broughttolight.com.
Okay.
Broughttolight.com, and that's a podcast that I do.
Okay.
And there's 3 episodes up there right now, half hour each.
Okay.
That lay out the story in an audio. It's a podcast. So
okay.
It's half hour episodes. And it lays out everything that's going on in South Dakota.
Gotcha.
We have more episodes coming very soon. There are 3 up there, and there's a lot more coming. But there's a ton of supplemental material up there as well.
So let me
videos,
ask you.
Interviews, documents.
Excellent. So the people can go there. Lee, do you consider this a type of genocide?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a dramatic term, and when I first heard it, I'm like, oh, that's a little hypey. But having been there and seeing the condition the Lakota Indian people are living in, and intense poverty, and they can't get justice,
right?
And
they're not allowed to have counsel when they walk into a courtroom, which violates every constitutional right. I mean, you have a right to counsel.
And they weren't able to get that story publicized, and they weren't able to get the Medi rape scandal publicized. And I spent most of the beginning of this year. I put I put thousands of dollars of my own money into promoting the story on Facebook, basically buying ads
to try to get some justice for the Native American children.
To try to get the story out. In other words, I
can't get it out. Nobody's listening.
I would love nothing better than to people are like, well, it's one-sided. No, this is the other side. I'd love nothing better than to sit down and talk to Marty Jackley and have him actually answer some questions, or Mike Rounds, who's the sitting senator, or John Thune, or Kristi Noem. We went to these politicians. Kristi Noem's the congresswoman. We went with the report that I didn't prepare. A lot of this material I didn't write. It was pre-existing. I came into the story, and I did a lot of original work, but there was a lot that was done. I was standing on the shoulders of other people who'd been involved in this for a long time. We could not get anyone
to even so much as comment. Right?
Yeah, to even so much as comment or We couldn't get the media to write about it. And I have never seen anything like it in my life. I'm just telling you, I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Now, isn't your specialty investigating corruption?
Yeah, it's a lot of what I do.
So for you to say that, it really speaks volumes, because if you have spent your years investigating specifically corruption, or a good part of it, and you come to South Dakota and you see what the government is doing and Child Protective Services is doing to these children, and knowing, walking in and seeing porn everywhere, seeing these dice, the children disclosing to them, and they're walking away and they're writing a year-end report that says everything's fine in the frontier of the Maddie's home front. Something is desperately wrong, and so therefore you're really feeling like it's not just the Maddie family, it's the entire population. I mean, certainly Native American population, I should say.
But to be sure, some white families as well. It's a completely corrupt government that's dependent on this outside federal money from foster care that was admitted openly by the former governor, Bill Janklow, before he died. He said, we're a poor state. We need the money coming in from outside.
So we'll take 100% of the children that we happen to suck into this courthouse, 100%,
yeah.
And to get extra money, we will deem each and every one 100% and not one short to have some type of a disability, because that will increase the federal funding that we are getting,
yes.
And we're a poor state.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, because it actually didn't require a tremendous amount of
you didn't have to look too hard. You didn't have to look too hard. It's there.
It's all out there. Yeah, it's all out there.
That's the amazing part, isn't it, Lee? It's all right there, and yet so ignored.
The one thing I was able to do was to get people who were reticent to talking, and people who were afraid. Let's be blunt.
Right.
People who were afraid to talk, I got them talking, and we did a press conference, and the whole thing is up online, including I label who all the reporters are. We had TV news cameras, we had newspapers, and nobody covered the story ever. They never covered it. And so I went up and humiliated them and said, look, this is what's being kept from you. And people in South Dakota were contacting the TV station, contacting the newspapers, going, when are you going to cover this? And they said, oh, well, we will, but these are just allegations. They're like, it's not just allegations. I heard audio. I saw emails. That's more than allegations. And it's an incredible story. And like I say, if people look into it, there's a lot of material on the Medi case. And you'll look into it and you'll be like, how did this possibly happen? How did this possibly happen? And why is it still going on?
I read a report, and I'm failing, and I thought I had it up on my screen here, but I can't seem to find it. Were there many children within these Native American communities that were taken away, that were later found dead, that were killed, that were murdered, that died suspiciously, that you're aware of?
No, I'm not aware. I'm not really aware of that.
Okay,
I think that there's.
So
yeah, that's not.
Okay.
I mean, it wouldn't.
I got you.
It wouldn't surprise me, because one of the things that happens is when the kids age out, they're just dumped, right? So when the kids turn 18 or whatever, and there's no longer going to be federal money,
right.
In a lot of cases, they're just
well, yeah.
dumped.
I mean, that's across the nation anyway. As soon as you're 18, you get the boot and go fend for yourself, even though you haven't been taught any life skills. And we've covered that on my show. And foster children who have aged out have come on, and they don't know how to cook. They don't know how to budget. They don't know how to provide for themselves, because they were never taught, because they're too busy being thrown from household to household and raped and beaten and tortured. Who has time to sit and look at books and learn how to actually keep a budget? It's the saddest situation. So it might be better to say it's a genocide of a culture. It's a genocide of a culture. Okay,
that's what it is.
And a wonderful attorney that we respect highly, Sean McMillan, he corrected me, and I stand corrected, Sean, 100% corrected. Okay, but it is in fact genocide of a culture, and there is a stereotypical drive that is they do discriminate, even though the Native Americans folks were here before we were. With all due respect.
The big thing that's been happening this year is there's a rash of suicides. There is a rash of suicides.
Within that population in South Dakota?
Yes, yeah. There's a horrible, huge per capita. I think there were, I want to say 13 suicides of teenagers at the beginning of the year on one reservation.
Really?
And those numbers could be a little off, but it's like, if they're off, they're not off by much.
Okay.
It was a huge problem of suicides. And when you talk to the kids, or when you look at what's going on there, they're despairing, and they should be. I don't know how else to put it. They should be despairing.
Did the sister of these? We have only like 2 minutes left. Did the sibling of these children try to fight, or is that just, I mean, you said it earlier, fighting a system where you don't have a chance to win? Was that more or less her attitude? Do you know?
That is more or less their attitude, and they'll know they'll get crushed. For instance, the Attorney General, Department of Social Services, is under the Attorney General, and he's got his own private police force, the Department of Criminal Investigation, and he's also in charge of proceedings for lawyers, the discipline board that takes care of legal complaints. There's no independent, and people from the Attorney General's office sit on the medical board too. So
they're all, this is a very, very tight net web, and you're either going to get caught or you're going to head out of there because you're not winning. They've got
right.
ears in the aisles of the grocery store. Come on, you're not winning.
And that's what it is. No, you're not winning. And it's a very small group, but it's all the same people. It's all the same people. And and when you've got the media in the bag, which they are, I mean,
right.
the short version is Lawrence and Schiller's a big advertising agency. Craig Lawrence ran the Republican Party. The big TV station out there is called Kello, Kelo, and their website's Kelloland. And if you look at Kelloland, at the very bottom of their website, it says website designed by Lawrence and Schiller. In other words, the number one media outlet in South Dakota is
not. Yeah, they're in
arm in arm with the guy who runs up to a few months ago, ran the Republican Party, which is the Democrats didn't even bother to run candidates for Secretary of State.
Well, listen, if you know this information, you're passing it along. Certainly they know. I'm looking at some statistics right now. South Dakota's suicide rate of 12.48 deaths per 100,000 people is above the national average of 11.26 deaths per 100,000, according to the American Association of Suicidology. So...
Yeah, and a lot of times they don't include the Native Americans.
Right.
So when they talk about the per capita income for South Dakota,
they're referring to the whites. They're referring, right, okay, because they are a different crowd. They are handled differently. They're addressed differently. Folks in the dependency court, they have a separate judge. So the judge does not handle the cases involving Indian descended children. Lee, we have to go. I want to continue this, maybe perhaps in a couple of weeks, in 3 weeks or so. I'm going to look at our schedule. just to get into more of the depth of the families that have been affected by this very, very, what you consider to be the most corrupt place in the nation. And you certainly have a handle on corruption, as that's your specialty.
Yeah, like I said, I've never seen anything like it. It's because it's so small,
right?
That you have no recourse. There's no way out. There's
no way out.
No way out.
You're a prisoner there. You're a prisoner, and the children were made a prisoner again. The Maddie family, folks, you need to read this. We need to be a voice for these children. They thought for a moment, they had a breath of sanity. And South Dakota took them and threw them right back into the dungeon of hell and rape and torture that they had thought that they had escaped from. And it's disgusting. And we need to be a voice. The local media is not covering it. Lee has covered this. We've posted online his website, his blog, and his Facebook. MedicalKidnap.com is covering this issue, and they were very adamant about breaking down what's happening to the Lakota people. This is a genocide. Sean McMillan corrected me. It's not a genocide necessarily by deaths. It's a genocide by a culture. And this should not be happening to anybody. And I want to leave this show saying, again, in a state, we see that Child Protective Services is doing anything other than protecting the children. Actually, they are the driving force that gave the green light to keep these children in their place of rape. And there's nothing else. Of the dice game, of the alternative blowjob, or what was it, Brian?
Beating
or blowjob. My God.
Yeah.
Folks, America, wake up. It's time to protect the children. Because in a couple of years, when they grow up and they age out, they're going to have that population that's going to be killing themselves, and the other part is going to be killing you because they're pissed off and they've had it. Let's step forward, folks. Let's get some media in South Dakota. This is a real story. Lee, thank you for joining us. UBN Radio, we thank you for advocating for the safety, health, and welfare of children across this nation. It is up to each and every person who cares about their children, their grandchildren, and generations to come. If we don't protect them now, we're not going to be protected later. Thanks for joining us, folks. Thank you, Lee. Lee, I thank you for being such a voice for this and not letting it go. It will come back to you, and you really should, along with a few others, really be the leader on this story.
Well, thanks for letting us promote it, Tammy.
It's my pleasure. God bless you. God bless you, folks. UBN Radio.
Take
care, folks.
To the
See you
National
next
Safe
week.
Child Show on UBN Radio. For past episodes, visit the archives on ubnradio.com. And for more information, go to nationalsafechildcoalition.com. The views and opinions expressed in these radio programs are those of the individual hosts and do not reflect the official policy or position of Universal Broadcasting Network.
Now that you've found UBN Radio and discovered our quality talk shows, it's time to spread the word to friends, family, and the universe. 24 hours of music and talk radio without limits. That's why people keep coming back.